Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Richard Allen Turner. I'm a board-certified pediatrician. Welcome to my channel, Kids Info Network Dayton. I hope you enjoy the show. Focus Kids is coming right up. Hey everyone, Dr. T here for Focus Kids. We are going to talk about meaning making today with Dr. Tronick and Dr. Gold. So let's go ahead and get started. This is for both of you. Dr. Gold, I'll have you go first. What is the concept of meaning making?
It is the idea that the way we make sense of ourselves in the world emerges in moment-to-moment interactions with people close to us. So typically people think of meaning making in terms of words, like making sense of, but meaning making in the way we use it in the book and in Ed's research is much broader than that. So if you think about a newborn and a parent in relation to each other, their bodies make meaning of a sense of safety in their interactions, so that there's a bodily sensation of safety, and babies make meaning of the world way before they have actual thoughts and words to attach to that meaning.
And Dr. Tronick.
One example might be in the still face experiment, doing it with 4-month-olds or 6-month-olds. We did a manipulation in which it's a standard still face, the mother not responding to the infant, but we had the mother put her hands on the baby's hips and just apply a little pressure so that she was holding the baby while, in a sense, doing the still face. And what we found there, that the still face was much less distressing to the infant when the mother's hands were on the baby's body. And I see that as that the hands are conveying a meaning to the infant, that in fact you're safe and I'm here and I'm present with you. And that kind of meaning is made, especially with infants who don't have language or symbolic thought. It's made through behavior, and it's made through a whole set of physiologic and brain systems.
The book talks about emotional well-being as rooted in the quality of our earliest interactions and relationships. Again, I'd like to get both of your perspectives on this. How do we make meaning of those very early interactions, and how do they affect our overall health and emotional well-being? This time we'll start with Dr. Tronick.
The earliest interactions have both, if you want to talk about it, sort of psychological effects, but they also have physiological effects. Sometimes we use the word psychobiology to try and capture what's going on there. And in interactions, again, if you think about the still face, the mother's behavior not only leads to the behavioral distress in the infant, but we also see that it leads to changes in the infant's physiology. We find changes, for example, in the infant's heart rate, that this is becoming a stressful experience for the infant, and its effect is on physiologic systems.
And if I can expand into the clinical realm, we have an example in the book, and this is something I see quite often for a parent-child pair where there's some struggle with breastfeeding. So when the baby and the mother have kind of time and the mother feels calm herself and held, the kind of messiness of the interaction where the baby's not quite ready to feed and maybe needs to sleep a few minutes to settle their nervous system, and then the mother then tries again and the baby is able to latch on, and through that kind of difficulty and getting through it together, they have this very gratifying moment of calm and peace which literally feeds the baby, but also feeds the mother's sense of her self-efficacy. Like, I know how to do this because I went through this difficult time with my baby. Now, contrast with that. So both the baby and the mother then have this kind of hopeful meaning of the natural messiness of a feed. And if you contrast that with, let's say, a mother who's very anxious and a lot of people are telling her what to do and she feels overwhelmed, and the baby is increasingly screaming and her kind of natural authority is undermined for a variety of reasons, and let's say, as often does happen, the maternity nurses say, well, you have to give her a bottle. So these kinds of interactions give both the baby and the mother a whole different set of meanings. And believe me, I have worked with many families where that has happened, and that problematic meaning gets carried forward in other ways in the relationship over time.
Dr. Tronick, you just talked about, you just related the still face to meaning making. So we now know that even very young infants can adapt to difficult situations and environments. The book talks about how infants even very young infants can adapt to difficult situations and environments, but that adaptation can also be problematic.
What you have to think is that the infant is in a sense dealing with the moment by moment qualities of what's going on. So for an example of that would be an infant whose parent might be depressed or just withdrawn or just very stressed, and the infant has capacities to deal with that parent's interactions, even though the interactions aren't as positive as we would like to see them. If the infant makes an adaptation to that, copes with the lack of responsiveness of the parent who's withdrawn or constantly stressed, the infant begins to develop a way of interacting that helps them to cope with the stress that they're experiencing. But what it then may do in the long run, in particular, if they chronically experience this, is that they then come with that style of interacting, and then they meet someone, a relative, a parent, a sibling, who would in fact engage in very positive interactions. But because of the way they've developed this pattern of interaction, kind of their habits of interacting, they then disrupt the interaction that's with a person who could be positive. So the adaptation that took place early on becomes problematic in the long run.
If I may just add that this whole idea of behavior as serving a function is really critically important, that it has an adaptive function. So typically we describe things that we think of as problematic as symptoms, but behaviors have, if you recognize that the behavior has an adaptive function, rather than just eliminating the behavior, if you understand what its adaptive function is in the relationship, then you're in a much better place to be able to shift those meanings and create healthier patterns of interaction.
Chapter 3 talks about a story involving a little boy named Henry. And he had extreme sound hypersensitivity. Dr. Tronick, first of all, what are the origins of these sensory processing difficulties?
The origins, I think, are not very well explained. One of the things we know about any biological function is that there's a distribution of that function. Some people are high on it, some people are right at the average, some people are very low at it. So you could think about sensory thresholds, how quickly you respond to a particular sensory input, varies across individuals. But individuals who might be either very low or very high may then, in certain contexts, have problems because, for example, typical play interactions, like playing peekaboo with a baby who has a high reactivity to sensory input, may overwhelm that infant and lead to distress. Whereas an infant who has a kind of low reactivity may not fully engage in the interaction. And then those patterns and the reaction of the infant and then the reaction of the parents to it over time leads to interactive problems and other behavioral problems.
Dr. Tronick, a couple of questions for you. Most of us aren't bothered by these everyday sounds or in general sensory processing, environmental input that we get. How do people with sensory processing difficulties make meaning of this myriad of input? And if it's a big question, so the book talked about Henry and sound sensitivity. So if you want to just kind of stick to sound sensitivity, that's fine.
One way to think about it, and while it is a complicated problem, a fairly simple-minded way to think about it. And by the way, this is the way I think about it, so we can hold to the simple-minded aspect of it, is that when you're hyper-responsive, hyper-reactive to something like an auditory stimulus, that what it leads to is all the bodily reactions and all the physiologic reactions. But the meaning that gets made of it, given all of these reactions, is that something fearful may be happening. And I think people listening can just take an example where there's a sudden loud sound in your environment that's completely unexpected. And what it does is lead to a little increase in your heart rate. It leads to some kind of neurohormones and neurotransmitters being activated, and you're startled and you're potentially frightened by the sound. I think children who have these kinds of sensitivities experience the world as being potentially or often dangerous or threatening, even when it's, for most other people, it's a typical kind of event.
Dr. Gold, your input on that one?
Yeah, so I think the classic example, which is something that I see a lot in my practice, is the birthday party. So where a child who has a more sort of typical response to sounds and does not necessarily get overwhelmed by them, a birthday party is just fun and there are other kids there, whereas a child who makes meaning of a lot of sensory input in sound as overwhelming and has difficulty processing it will make meaning of that experience as frightening and overwhelming. And then I would add that again, you always need to look at the relational context, because then the parent typically often feels a lot of shame and embarrassment that their child is not acting in the way the other kids are, and might respond to their child in frustration, and then the kind of the meaning of the fear of the sound gets mixed up in the meaning in the relationship. But that can go a different way, whereas if a family who is able to kind of meet their child's unique biological sensitivities and help them to manage them, the child might gradually be able to move on to make meaning of that experience as non-threatening.
An example that my wife and I just recently experienced in the time of COVID was we visited really close friends for the first time at their house. And it was in the countryside, so we were planning to stay for probably 2 nights. And certainly what I experienced and what my wife then was able to explain to me was that we felt the following kind of experience, which is we wanted to be really close with these people. At the same time, as you got close to them, your alarm bells were going off because of now people and touching people and being close to them is a threatening situation. And so I found negotiating that, I found dealing with that really quite a challenge. And I felt anxious and stressed by what was going on.
Dr. Gold, how can we help parents and young children with this and other sensory processing difficulties manage through the mismatch and repair of these rather trying issues to try to achieve some balance, possibly even harmony, and hopefully ultimately healing?
So I think it comes down to something we've probably talked about before, validating their experience and protecting time to listen. Because I find that if a child comes in when things have really gone awry, even at the age of 3 or 4, often things were difficult right from when the child was born, and allowing parents the time to tell that story and make sense of their experience, appreciate what their child's perspective is, and then shift to from a place of, as we talked about earlier, managing their symptoms to helping the child make sense of their experience. Like, first, the parent has to appreciate that these are not something wrong with their child, but rather his or her unique way of being in the world, and then help that child to make sense of and then manage that experience, whether it's by things, we give a number of examples in the book of kids who found music as a way or to calm their sensory sensitivities, because often kids who have sensory sensitivities are very talented musically. So channeling those sensitivities into a more adaptive form, which can happen naturally when parents feel supported and can engage their own natural intuition.
Dr. Tronick?
I was thinking that whether or not a child has any kind of particular sensitivities, with the quote-unquote typical child, whatever exactly that would mean, we're always facing the challenge of figuring out and adjusting to how they are in the world. All children have temperaments or personality, and they all have ways that kind of fit to the way the parent wants them to be, and they all have ways of not fitting to the way that really fits to the parent. So while we talk about good enough parenting, we can also think about something like a good enough fit. We're always struggling to make a good enough fit. And I remember two cases, one of a mother who was extremely concerned about her 3 or 4 month old infant, who was for some other parents a really quote unquote the child they wanted. This was The baby was a little girl. She didn't cry very much. She was really well regulated. She didn't get very activated. And here was a parent who was expecting and wanted a child who would be really driving and forceful and robust. And then on the other side was a parent who had that robust baby, the baby who really cried when something was wrong. It's actually the kind of baby I like, the one that have a lot of activation going. But this mother found the intensity of this infant to be somewhat frightening for her. And so we had to think about what the baby was like, and then we had to think about how the parent could fit to that and make an adjustment to it. And as you said, then find ways of repairing those kinds of mismatches.
I'd like to share for a moment a wonderful quote from chapter 8 of The Power of Discord that really kind of offers inspiration and hope. Your emotions grow out of your relational history. Even if you've had the most adverse set of early experiences, when you immerse yourself in new relationships with space for mismatch and repair, meanings of hopelessness can be transformed into meanings of hope. So I'd like to close this episode with both of you. 2 questions. Why is it so important to understand that quote? And how do we make new meanings in relationships to foster healing, growth, and development? Dr. Gold, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you for reading that. And yes, I think that is really a core idea of hope, because often when you have a book that has a premise that meanings are made right from birth, people tend to kind of freeze up and think, oh, wow, well, things went really poorly for me, and so it's hopeless. So it's really quite the opposite of that, which is that, but that when you have an opportunity for many interactions over time, you can make new meanings throughout your life. The key point, though, is if it's over time. In many relationships, we tend to have this kind of quick fix solution, unidimensional solutions, and so it's not one dimension or even 2 dimensions. And I just heard this lovely story of a mom who's just had the most horrific trauma, and it's a very serious substance use problem, and talking about how she's been writing and crocheting, and in addition having a whole bunch of relationships, not only with her therapist, but with her peer recovery coach and the administrator in the peer recovery program. And like she's created this milieu of activities and relationships that are going to take a lot of time, because she had a really problematic childhood, and even very recently a lot of struggles, but that's what's needed to help her now going into her future make new meanings of herself in the world.
I think developmentally, as Claudia suggests, we tend to think, especially now, what happens in infancy, it kind of becomes fixed and unchanging. But the actual phenomenon is that all throughout our development, we're developing new capacities. We're developing new ways of being in the world. The infant goes from not having language to having language. The adolescents, as difficult as sometimes they are, develop really abstract thought and the ability to conceive of all sorts of possibilities. All of those capacities get played out in our interactions. And so something early on that happens that might lead to a problematic way of being, some kind of trauma or something like that. Over time, the development of new capacities and the development or the experience of being able to overcome whatever that, for example, fearful or anxious state was. As you begin to overcome that in new relationships, you're able to make really, really new meaning about yourself and the world, and to develop relationships. So the hopeful part in the idea of the mismatch repair model is that that's a process that goes on throughout development. It goes into adulthood, it keeps on going, and it continues to have or can have positive effects, and really change how you feel about yourself in the world.
Thank you both very much. I just want to say, through this whole process, it's been such a privilege, not just talking to you, but getting to know both of you. You both are always welcome back on Focus Kids, individually, together, with a party. It doesn't matter. You both are always welcome back on the show at any time. And I thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a great privilege.
And with that, and to wrap up the series discussing the power of discord with co-authors Dr. Ed Tronick and Dr. Claudia Gold, I'll simply leave you with these final thoughts. Smile regularly, laugh often, and always, always treat each other with kindness, compassion, humor, and empathy. Don't forget to check out The Power of Discord and all their other incredible works. Links below in the description. And as always, if you like this video or just got some useful information from it, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and the bell so you don't miss an episode. That's it for this episode. Thanks so much for watching Focus Kids. I'm Dr. T, and I'll catch you on the flip side. We're out.